Hello everyone, welcome to another Flesh and Blood video. In this one, we're not going over any super serious deck. Instead, we're going over a Riptide list using some of the new cards from the Hunted. I decided to make this one now for a few reasons. One, I think the new trap Riptide keeps getting a bunch of new traps and they don't end up doing anything. So I thought might as well make a trap deck for Riptide because he keeps getting traps. And although I do think this card is very good, I think it'll be like every other card Riptide has gotten and be really good, but not make him like insanely powerful. And by no means is this going to be the final deck that Riptide will play with this new card. This is just a fun deck. So I'm not even sure if. Well, I think this deck can win, but it's not going to be fun for your opponent because you're going to block every card with 4 traps and do 4 to them every turn. And the other reason for this video is because I really thought we'd have the weapons by now for the hunted heroes, but considering we don't even have all of the Arachnes, the first impressions ain't happening. So until we get the weapons and the other Arachnes, I can't do the first impressions video. So, Riptide. With all of that, let's get started. Riptide, Lurker of the Deep, has the effects of when a trap you control triggers, do 1 to the attacking hero, and when you play a card from your hand, you may put a card from your hand face down into your arsenal. This matters for Trench. It also matters for pumps, but we're not playing those. That's not this type of deck. He also has 38 health because he has a damaging ability on his hero ability. For the equipment, we are playing Barbed Castaway as the weapon. This is because we have a lot of aim counter synergies in this deck, and we want the ability to give an arrow an aim counter if it's already in our arsenal. And we also barely have arrows in this deck. Crown of Providence, because we're not on that many arrows, we can't really use New Horizon to the best effect. Trench of Sunken Treasures, because it's just the best Riptide chess piece, also has really good synergy with the new trap. Sharpshooter, because it's a 1 block and lets us load an arrow with an aim counter. And Perch Grapplers, because they're 2 block. If you wanted, you could play these shoes that came with the Azalea Armory deck alongside the Sharpshooters. I just don't remember what they're called right now. But those also work fine. They do have 1 less block, but they do let you go a little wide if you ever would want to. And then Quiver of Abyssal Depths, because this is very much a fatigue deck. For the extra equipment, we have Balance of Justice, because it's that and Crown are like the mainstay generic helmets. Bullseye Bracers for another piece of Arcane Barrier. And Enchanted Quiver, which is a new card from the Hunted. It's a instant to prevent the next 1 arcane damage that you would be dealt, but if you have a face-up arrow in your arsenal, you prevent 2 instead, which can be done with the instant speed of Barbed Castaway, both of them letting you either load an arrow or turn an arrow face up in your arsenal. So you can easily get the 2 prevention from this, but this will only come in versus Wizard when you need the 2 prevention. For the main board, you can see that we're a 65 card main board. I don't see a reason to ever play less cards than this. I guess if you're playing against Kano, you go down Inertia Traps and Frailty Traps, and probably Tripwire Traps. And then you go down 9, you go up 6, because these are, well, probably go up only 2 Pendulum Trap, but just because they're a little higher color. And another arrow, just so you can do more damage, but I'm not going to put... I do want to put sideboarding. I will put sideboarding. It's very basic, but I will put sideboarding in the notes of the deck list by the time this goes up, because it is very basic. But 65 card main board, you're playing this 65 into pretty much every matchup unless you need more cards versus other fatigue matchups or you need these two specifically. So let's start with the attacks because they're not core, but they're sort of the main idea of how we're going to slow down the opponent. So Barbed Castaway is a 1 for 5 where if it has an aim counter and it hits, we can choose red, yellow, or blue, and until the start of our next turn, our opponent can't pitch cards of that chosen color. Most of the time it will be blue, but it obviously depends on the matchup. Sometimes you will say yellow if it's like a light hero, or red if it's like a draconic hero, depending on how many reds they play, right? I don't know the list of the new draconic heroes yet. Also probably blue against draconic, but mostly blue makes them unable to pitch blues if they don't block it, which can slow them down. Of course, that's kind of what these attacks are designed to do. 3 CNC because it's CNC. If you don't have CNC, play any other CNC replacement. But if you're playing a fatigue deck, you probably already have the CNCs because they're a good card in every deck, but especially fatigue. Immobilizing Shot is sort of a mini Red in the Ledger. It makes it so if it hits with an aim counter, the hero you hit can't play more than one attack and non-attack action, which Red in the Ledger makes it so they can only play one action, so this is a little worse, but it's there and it can work out sometimes. Murky Water is a Riptide spec. It's a 2 for 6. It gets +1 in Dominate if it has an aim counter, and whenever it hits, you can banish 3 traps in your graveyard face down and put a random one in your arsenal. So you just get to recycle a trap, which is really good. And this also gets Dominate, so we can end the game with it. We have Stone Rain, which also gets Dominate if it is an aim counter, and when it hits, we can banish a card in their hand face down, and at the beginning of the end phase, they get it back. So you kind of intimidate them. At the beginning of their end phase, they get it back. So you can take the card out of their hand and then give them the arsenal, yeah, but it's disrupting one card out of their hand, which is pretty good. And then the last attack in the deck is Intoxicating Shot, because it lets you trigger your traps, and it's a blue and it's a Riptide spec, so why not? Moving on, let's talk about the not traps. There are a few not traps, but since the traps are the main point of the deck, we'll talk about them last. Sigil of Solace is the only red here. This gains you life, which is obviously great since you're playing for the fatigue plan, but also because it's a card you're playing from your hand, it lets you load a card with Riptide's ability, which can be great when you want to fire an arrow with an aim counter, because the bow loading from hand doesn't give them an aim counter. So if your hand was like Sigil Blue Murky Water, you could play the Sigil, load the Murky Water face down, and then flip it up with Barbed Castaway and still fire it. So Sigil Sauce is really helpful for that. Another card that does also let you do that is Line It Up. Line It Up flips the arrow itself and also gives a +3, but it costs 1. So pretty much instead of using your bow to flip something up, it's letting you load from Riptide and then flipping the card up and giving an aim counter for the same cost as flipping it up with the bow. So Line It Up, and this is just a Riptide card. It's in the Azalea deck, but this is a Riptide card. It was 100% designed with Riptide in mind. The other, well, there's two other, but the other pump in the deck is Deadeye. This is also a 1 for 3, but if we have an aim counter, if the arrow has an aim counter, it gains on hero hit, look at their hand, and discard a card. So just more disruption that can stop the opponent from killing you or put them in a spot where they have to play into your traps, as well as it's more aim counter synergies, which is what this deck really wants. The last yellow non-attack is Codex of Frailty. Because it's Codex of Frailty, this card's expensive. I would say a replacement, but there isn't one. I'm sorry. If you play Assassin or Ranger, you kind of need this card. And it's probably going up because we're getting another Assassin. The last two are blue. Oh, actually, we have Remembrance. I'll talk about that after. But two other blues that work with traps but aren't specifically traps. Plan for the Worst is a good card. It's a 0-cost 3-block blue that is played in Riptide now. It lets you look at a hero's hand and arsenal, and at the beginning of your end phase of their next end phase, you seek and destroy them. So it's a you don't even need to hit seek and destroy. The card itself doesn't have go again, but it also lets you search for up to 3 traps and put them in your hand, and then you shuffle 2 cards from your hand into your deck. You don't have to shuffle the traps away, notably. So if you play this with 2 other cards in your hand, you can get 3 traps and then still keep the other 3 traps. This is really good when we talk about Chain Reaction, the new trap from The Hunted. But already this card's very strong, and it's one of the better Riptide trap support cards. One of the worst Riptide trap support cards is Reelin. This is a blue instant with an X cost. You look at the top X+1 cards of your deck and you put up to 4 traps in your hand. So obviously if you pitch this in a blue and if you play this and pitch a blue and you hit 4 traps, you drew 2 extra cards, which is really good. This card could also be played just at 0 to try to draw a trap off the top. You're mainly going to use this with your Trench, though, to look at 2 and try to find more. But, this card isn't always the most consistent thing. And it's really in here just because it's a blue trap synergy card, not because it has that draw traps effect. But that is a reason to play the card. And then the last not trap in the deck is Remembrance. This is a 0-cost instant that lets you shuffle 3 actions from your graveyard into your deck, and then you banish it. This lets you shuffle in Plans, it lets you shuffle in Murky Waters, Line It Ups, Dead Eyes, CNCs, any action in your deck that you want to play again. Remembrance lets you shuffle in, similar to the Quiver of Abyssal Depths, but not just arrows, which is really good. And this card was played a while ago when Fatigue was super meta, and Fatigue isn't really the most meta thing right now, but it will be again at some point, I'm sure. But this deck is Fatigue, so you definitely do want them in there. Finally, let's talk about the traps. Traps trigger off of 3 different things. A attack with Go Again, a attack with power greater than its base, or a reaction being played. Some traps don't trigger, they just auto-trigger pretty much. Those are the ones that can only be played from your arsenal. We'll talk about them. Because they have a when this defends trigger, not a when this defends a something trigger. So Frailty Trap and Inertia Trap both trigger off of attacks having something. Frailty triggers off of Go Again, and Inertia triggers off of increased power. And they give their respective token. Blood Rot Trap triggers off of a reaction, and it's not good enough for its effect. The reaction traps are the hardest to use. So they either have the strongest effect, which I'd argue 2 damage is very strong, or they just don't see play. And they don't see play most of the time. We do actually play Pendulum Trap in the sideboard, which is the yellow reaction trap, but the only real trap we're playing that's reaction-based is Spike Pit, which is just way too good of a card if we actually get the trigger on it. So we got to play that. But Frailty Trap and Inertia Trap help slow our opponent down. Tripwire Trap is the red auto trap. This one is a 0 for 4 block. If you'll notice, all of the traps that aren't these auto trigger traps all block 3. That's how they were designed, since they're going to get extra value off of them from Riptide. But this one blocks 4. When it defends, effects don't trigger when an attack hits this chain link unless the attacking hero pays 1. This is an auto-trigger trap, so the person attacking you will also take 1. And these traps can only be played from Arsenal, notably, but because Riptide's ability lets you load cards from your hand, you can play a different trap from your hand to load this and then play this trap. So you get a lot of value from these since they're so easy to play. Moving on to the yellow traps. Boulder Trap is a +1 power trap, and it puts a -1 defense counter on an equipment they control. This can be really useful to interact with high block equipment. If they have any 2-block equipment, you're taking 2 health off of them, and especially because you have a lot of arrows with great hit effects and some with dominate, your opponent's going to want to use their equipment to defend themselves from those, which the Boulder Trap can help alleviate. Chain Reaction is the brand new trap. This is a go again triggering trap at yellow, and it says when you get the trigger, you may turn a non-attack action card in your arsenal face up. If you do, you may play it this turn as though it were an instant. So Chain Reaction, notable for letting you play 3 cards. 1, 3 of a kind, which is not in this deck. I know some people are going to try it, but if you're playing 3 of a kind, you're not playing a trap-based deck, you're playing a more aggressive Riptide, because if you 3 of a kind, you can't play traps after that because you can't play not arrows that turn. So, from your hand. You can only play cards from your arsenal that turn. So, that was Chain. So, 3 of a kind Chain Reaction is a more aggressive deck. As well as notably with Chain Reaction, Riptide lets you load a card before the Chain Reaction goes off. So you can load your action before this resolves to get the flip up and play it. So it makes it really consistent. The other one is Codex of Frailty, which isn't the best thing to do with the trap, but if you have no other cards in your hand and your opponent has a card in their hand, you can Chain Reaction to make them recycle something instead, and then you get an attack back that you can maybe play on your turn. So that can happen, but it's not the best thing to do. The main thing you want to be doing with Chain Reaction, though, is plan for the worst. This gives them the immediate destruction effect, which they can't play around. They can't plan to play something else because they didn't have a turn to react to the plan for the worst. It's just going to happen at the end of the turn. And it lets you tutor up more traps on your opponent's turn, as well as let you see what they got so you know what traps to get. But this is an incredibly powerful combo that lets you fix your hand to stop what your opponent wants to do. Say that you see that they just have 1 big attack left, but you have a bunch of other go-again traps. You can find a lot of the increased power traps and then get rid of the go-again traps back in your deck so you can do some damage with Riptide. So this card's really cool. And I can't wait to see it come out because I want to see if it makes Riptide actually insanely good or not. The next yellow trap is the Pitfall Trap. This is the yellow only from Arsenal trap. It only blocks 3 and it does 2 damage if they don't pay 1. So this can be either 1 or 3 damage, which is pretty nice sometimes. And the opponent taking 2 off of this is generally really good for you, because it lowers the amount of traps you actually need to play. And the final yellow trap is Tar Pit Trap. This is a go-again triggering trap that stops hit effects of the next attack action to hit this turn. The final 6 traps in the deck are, 3 of them are Riptide's legendary specialization traps. Buzzsaw reduces the power of a attack with power greater than its base to its base, and it can't gain power this turn. Collapsing Trap makes the opponent discard their hand and draw that many cards -1. And Spike Pit Trap triggers on an opponent using a reaction, this chain link, and puts the top card of the deck into their graveyard, and they lose life, where X is the number of cards with that name in their graveyard. So you're playing these because they're blue 3 blocks, and they're Riptide specs, and they're traps, and they're all pretty good. Collapsing Trap is the best one. Spike Pit Trap is a little inconsistent because it's hard to trigger, but it gets a lot of work done, and Buzzsaw Trap just is good versus pumping decks since it sets it to its base. The last trap in the deck is Rock Slide. The last trap in the main board is Rock Slide Trap. This is a 0-cost blue 2-block trap. It can only be played from your arsenal, and when it defends, you give an attack -2 unless the attacking hero pays a resource. So it can be 4 if the opponent decides not to pay 1, which is pretty good. So Rock Slide Trap does have that upside of being a 4-block sometimes, as well as it's a blue for all your pitching. The last section we're going to look at is the remaining cards in the inventory. Murkmire Grapnel is another aim counter synergy arrow, and it can't be prevented. This is going to come in versus decks like Enigma and Prism, who have a high amount of prevention that you'll want to destroy. Pretty obvious. And then finally, Pendulum Trap, which will come in versus high reaction decks. This is a reaction-based trap. It's the yellow one, and it makes the hero mill 2 cards, which is great in your fatigue strategy. A lot of reaction-based decks are aggressive decks, so making them mill 2 cards will only help you fatigue them sooner. And that's going to be the end of the video. Sorry if my voice sounds a little off. I am a little under the weather right now, but hopefully next week I will be back to full health and able to make another video for you all, which I probably still will make a video. We'll just have to see what it is. I'm hoping we see the rest of the hunted stuff. If we don't, I'm sure I'll find another deck list to show you all. But for now, that is going to be the end of the video, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye.